In the scorching heat of the summer of 2025, inside a familiar meeting room at the White House, where economic, security, and industrial discussions usually unfold in dry, scripted fashion, President Donald Trump suddenly stood up. He wasn't reading from a memo. He didn't wait until the end of the press conference. Like a seasoned director, he delivered a twist right in the middle of the calm narrative. The US would impose a 50% tariff on all imported copper. No one saw it coming. No advisors had been warned. And within minutes of the first update from the official White House account on X, the world began to stir. Analysts, financial markets, and major manufacturers all scrambled for information. Half panicked, half skeptical. But soon, Trump's full statement to the press was released. He called copper the silent backbone of American industry and defense, a metal that might seem ordinary, but is everywhere, at the core of electric vehicle motors, semiconductor circuit boards, military radars, smart weapons, and even the national power grid, and therefore it had to be protected as a strategic security asset. This reasoning was backed by a special legal provision, Section 232 of National Security Law, the same one Trump had invoked for steel and aluminum back in 2018. This time, he wielded it for copper, a 50% tariff, not just high, but globally intimidating. It was no longer a trade negotiation, it was a declaration of power. Within the first 24 hours, the consequences were already visible. Importing companies in the US practically froze. They lost access to over $4.2 billion worth of supply, mainly from Canada, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. Copper prices on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange shot up more than 13%, breaking past $6 per pound, a level unseen in nearly 2 decades. Financial markets wobbled, but the bigger shock came from sectors that seemed unrelated, like electric vehicles, construction, and energy. Trump's voice echoed in the video of the announcement. We cannot rely on foreign countries to sustain our great industry. A bold, almost provocative statement. But in this high of power and drive for self-reliance, it seemed the US government had overlooked one crucial factor: how the market actually works. Because even before people could fully analyze the impact of the blow elsewhere, the market had already begun to react in ways no one expected. Copper prices in the US exploded, while prices in London, where international contracts remained unaffected, dipped slightly. A strange paradox emerged, a 25% price gap between the two markets. And then, once the price difference grew large enough to promise hefty profits, a quiet storm began to form. Speculators didn't sit still. They redrew the trade map, crafting new, clever, roundabout routes to slip through the newly erected tariff walls. Loop-around contracts started popping up. Pure copper relabeled as alloys, scrap recycled into feedstock, shipping containers rerouted through third countries, then re-entering the US under completely different names. A policy declared in the name of protecting supply chains and industrial autonomy had now become a game for those who knew the legal loopholes best. And while Washington kept praising resource independence back home, chaos was beginning to spread. It all happened too fast and far too easily slipped out of control. But like every shock in economic history, when prices surge abnormally and regulations are warped by sudden policy shifts, the market doesn't stay still. It doesn't protest with banners or rallies. It responds through quiet movements of capital, redefined contracts, and new trade routes opening in the shadows. Within just a few days, the US copper market had become so unrecognizable that even domestic companies couldn't make sense of it anymore. Prices in Chicago kept climbing, pushing beyond all expectations, while in London, where trading still operated under the old rules, prices stayed flat or dipped slightly. That price gap, seemingly small at first glance, opened a massive opportunity for those bold enough to gamble. Buy cheap from global markets, transform the product, and sneak it into the US under the guise of something entirely different. And so began a new profit chase. Shipments of pure copper were reclassified as non-standard alloys, high-tech scrap, or industrial recycled copper. Each new label became a loophole to dodge the tariff. Alternate routes through Mexico, Malaysia, and even ports in Eastern Europe suddenly saw a spike in activity. Behind those quiet containers arriving in US ports was an elaborate process to prove that what was inside was no longer imported copper. The government spoke of national security, but the market understood only one thing. Where there's a price gap, there's profit to be made. And when the law tries to get ahead of reality, reality will find a way to sidestep the law. The irony, a policy created to protect domestic manufacturing was now throwing it into disarray. Large corporations could afford lawyers, set up foreign subsidiaries, and restructure supply chains. But small and medium-sized businesses, the factories in Ohio, Indiana, or Pennsylvania, had no such luxury. They struggled to find replacement suppliers, renegotiate contracts, recalculate production costs, while competitors from Asia and Europe quietly slipped into the gap. On one hand, American companies had to buy copper at inflated prices. On the other, they were forced to compete with imported products made using untaxed copper. This was the greatest paradox. A tariff policy meant to boost domestic advantage was now distorting the very market it aimed to protect. All economic logic was turned upside down. While the US descended into temporary chaos sparked by its own decision, somewhere else, just a few hundred miles across the border, another response was quietly taking shape. Not from speculators, but from a country long considered America's most reliable partner in natural resources, Canada. Ottawa didn't speak out immediately. There were no hasty condemnations or public criticism, but behind closed doors, in urgent meetings among mining and export industry leaders, a strategic decision was made. If the US wants to go it alone, then Canada has no reason to keep playing the role of carrier. And so, less than a week after Trump's executive order, copper supply contracts from Canada to the US began to be suspended. Major corporations like Teck Resources and First Quantum announced temporary halts to US shipments. No protests, no outrage, just a few short lines in press releases, but enough to send a silent shockwave through the system. Because unlike other countries, Canada didn't retaliate with tariffs. They struck where it truly hurt, the supply. And this time, the US couldn't command or dictate terms. All it could do was watch as the northern border, once considered the world's most stable metal supply route, suddenly shut down. Unlike the loud, blaring responses often seen in trade wars, Canada's counterstrike unfolded in silence, and it was precisely that silence that made Washington all the more uneasy. No angry statements from the Prime Minister, no defiant tweets, just quiet signals from top mining corporations and a trail of internal memos circulating among key government departments. But the impact was anything but quiet. Within less than a week of the US tariff announcement, Canada's largest copper producers simultaneously declared suspensions or reevaluations of their export contracts to the US. In Vancouver, the CEO of a metallurgical company stated bluntly, "We can't build a strategy on a market that lacks stability." A simple sentence, but one that felt like a blade severing decades of trust between two closely linked economies. Instead of retaliating with tit-for-tat tariffs, Canada struck at America's weakest point, the actual supply. It wasn't just an economic counterpunch, it was a declaration of strategic sovereignty. Ottawa understood that continuing to supply copper under unjust taxation would reduce them to the role of a subservient supplier in the eyes of the Trump administration. And they refused to play that part. As Canada's supply lines began to tighten, Asian and European markets moved swiftly. Japan, South Korea, Germany, even China, high-tech economies hungry for copper, quickly stepped in to claim the contracts the US had just fumbled. Trade flows that once passed through Detroit, Texas, or California now began redirecting toward Yokohama, Busan, and Shanghai. And Canada didn't stop at pulling back. They took action. The federal government announced an investment package of over 1.8 billion Canadian dollars to expand export infrastructure, upgrading the ports of Prince Rupert and Vancouver, extending rail lines to metallurgical hubs, and funding companies adopting green refining technologies. No longer just a safe supplier, Canada now aimed to become a voice of influence in the global metals value chain. It marked a fundamental shift in mindset. No one wants to remain the perpetual logistics arm of another economy, especially when that burden is no longer accompanied by mutual trust. And in the moment Canada closed one door, it simultaneously opened new ones, not just for itself, but for any partner willing to share risks and respect long-term stability. But when one door closes, a tremor begins to echo across the border. Because the US didn't just lose a supplier, it lost a critical link in a supply chain it once believed unbreakable, and the consequences didn't take long to show. At factories across the industrial Midwest, disruptions began to surface. From Detroit to St. Louis, from Cleveland to Pittsburgh, where robotic arms once worked around the clock, the hum of machinery began to stutter. Some production lines were forced to pause for lack of raw materials. Where operations continued, input costs surged. American manufacturing, already trying to claw its way back after the pandemic and a global supply chain crisis, now faced a scenario no one wanted to believe: internal collapse from within. Not because of a lack of technology, not because of labor shortages, but because a single executive order had severed what was once thought to be the most dependable link of all. In the early days of August, as economic news outlets continued to report on the copper price shock, the ones feeling it most weren't the speculators on Wall Street. It was the engineers, factory workers, and small business owners across the heart of America. In Detroit, where the electric vehicle industry had once been the symbol of post-pandemic rebirth, cost projections were upended overnight. An average EV uses more than 80 kilograms of copper, and the 13% surge in copper prices alone added nearly $90 in material costs to each vehicle. It may seem like a small number, but multiplied across millions of units, it became an overwhelming burden. Tesla postponed some parts orders. Ford announced it was reconsidering timelines for new projects. Major manufacturers had buffers and reserves, but thousands of small and medium-sized businesses, especially in industrial states like Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri, weren't so lucky. Many were almost entirely reliant on Canadian copper. When that supply was suddenly cut off, they had no time to adjust. Some plants were forced to shut down temporarily or cancel contracts with clients in Europe and Asia. Lost orders, lost credibility, and lost market share to competitors from South Korea and Japan, where copper prices remained stable and supply chains remained intact. Things weren't much better in the construction sector. Copper isn't just in wiring, it's in HVAC systems, water pumps, and solar energy converters. As material costs spiked too quickly, many housing projects in Texas, Arizona, and Nevada had to revise plans or even pause construction in hopes that prices would fall. Everyday people, far removed from the political decisions in Washington, suddenly became indirect victims. Home prices rose, repair bills increased, the power grid became more expensive to maintain as utility companies had to buy high-priced raw materials just to keep running. And then came the electronics sector, where every circuit board, every microchip depends on a layer of copper thinner than a human hair. Device manufacturers in California, Texas, and North Carolina had to recalculate everything. Some young startups were knocked out of the market entirely, unable to absorb the sudden cost spike. Innovations were left in limbo. Ideas never even made it to the drawing board, killed by raw material costs before they had a chance to breathe. Internal chaos was no longer just a metaphor. It had become reality, visible in every cost sheet, every stalled production line, every layoff email. And the bitterest truth was this: all these losses didn't come from a natural disaster nor from a global financial meltdown. They came from a single executive order, one that claimed to protect American industry, yet ended up forcing that very industry to bear the brunt of its consequences. Amid the spreading wave of instability, a question began to echo louder, inside corporate boardrooms, academic circles, and on the front pages of newspapers. Was it worth it? Was that 50% tariff, under the banner of making America more self-reliant, inadvertently becoming a blow that crippled the very lifeblood of U.S. manufacturing? And while the U.S. wrestled with the unforeseen ripple effects, to the north, Canada wasn't just quietly cutting off its supply. They were preparing for an entirely new chapter. A chapter where they no longer wished to be the porter for an unpredictable giant. A chapter where, for the first time in decades, they chose to step out of America's shadow and rewrite their own role on the global trade map. For a long time, Canada had been seen as the gentle partner, a stable, reliable country always willing to adapt to the shifts and tremors coming from south of the border. It supplied lumber, aluminum, oil, and minerals, especially copper, in a steady stream that helped fuel the American industrial engine. But after the shock of the 50% tariff order, something changed. It wasn't just a political reaction. It was a structural shift. Canada no longer wanted to be a dependent shadow of the US economy. It wanted to be a center, not just of supply, but of decision-making. From Ottawa to western provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, a wave of strategic realignment began to roll out quickly. The federal government announced over 1.8 billion Canadian dollars in investments to upgrade seaports like Prince Rupert and Vancouver, key transit points that could connect directly to Asia without passing through the US. Railway lines were expanded, smart logistics systems deployed. And perhaps most crucially, a series of initiatives was launched to support domestic metal refineries, powered by green, low-emission technology, positioning Canada not just as a raw material provider, but as a responsible producer. At international forums, Canadian trade representatives no longer shied away from sensitive topics. They spoke out clearly. Canada needs partners who respect the principles of stability and transparency. And if a superpower like the US can't guarantee those two things, then it's time for Ottawa to open its doors to other options. Japan, South Korea, India, the EU, they all stood ready to sign long-term agreements with Canada, not just because they needed resources, but because they needed trust. And so Canada, once the silent carrier, was now stepping into the role of a strategic player with a clear voice. There was no need for loud declarations. But every move, from rerouting shipments and reinvesting in infrastructure to rejecting short-term deals that didn't bring sustainable value, was a sign of a nation rising on its own terms, quietly, but decisively and deliberately. The irony? As the US tried to use tariff power to reshape the supply chain in its favor, it was its oldest, closest allies who were the first to walk away. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Faced with the choice between bearing more risk or charting a new path, they chose the latter. And Canada wasn't alone. In the days following the initial chaos, the global community began looking at the US through a different lens. Chile, the world's top copper exporter, sent a formal diplomatic note expressing concern. Peru, a strategic partner in the region, began adjusting its export strategy. China, though silent in the press, quietly approached suppliers in both North and South America, offering competitive prices and discreetly sparking new waves of competition. The earthquake known as the 50% copper tariff was no longer a domestic issue. It had become a global signal, a warning. If one nation is big enough to defy order, the world is wise enough to find another way. And America, still the world's #1 economy, now found itself facing an unprecedented dilemma, isolated within the very system it once helped build. When the United States slammed the door on the world with a 50% tariff on imported copper, it wasn't just sending a message about power and self-reliance. It was also awakening long-simmering questions within the global community. Can Washington still be trusted as a partner? Can the global supply chain continue to revolve around a country willing to change the rules with the stroke of a pen? The answer, though not yet officially spoken, is becoming increasingly clear through quiet actions. Chile, the world's largest copper exporter and longtime US collaborator, has begun to shift course. While it continues to sell to the US, the majority of its newly mined copper is now under contract with South Korea, India, and the European Union, markets that carry no risk of sudden tariffs. Peru isn't sitting idle either. At regional economic forums, Lima has begun emphasizing the need to diversify trade partners, a diplomatic way of saying it's time to reduce dependence on the US. China, unusually restrained this time, took a smarter route. Beijing didn't issue bold condemnations, it simply acted. Chinese state-owned enterprises quietly approached copper producers in Canada, Chile, and Peru, offering long-term contracts at prices above those of the US, along with favorable logistics and financial terms. Without fanfare, China is using America's instability to regain influence it had lost to Washington during the post-COVID recovery period. In Europe, the pushback is also growing. Germany, France, and the Netherlands, countries with strong electronics and auto industries dependent on global copper supplies, voiced concerns about the contagion effect of US policy. Their fear, today it's copper, tomorrow aluminum, steel, lithium, and eventually high-tech sectors. Brussels began drafting mechanisms to protect internal supply chains, including fast-tracking new bilateral trade agreements that exclude Washington altogether. Even close G7 allies like Japan and South Korea are proceeding with caution. Tokyo held closed-door meetings with tech manufacturing firms, urging them to reassess their risk exposure to US-linked supply chains. Seoul, while maintaining a neutral stance, has expanded its copper mining and refining partnerships with Australia, a clear step to reduce dependency on unpredictable policy shifts from the White House. A new trade order is emerging, slowly but steadily. Not because the world wants to move away from the US, but because it has to, in order to preserve system stability. In an era where trust is the most valuable currency in trade, unilateral decisions, even those cloaked in patriotism, can leave a superpower increasingly isolated. And now, as the noise of political declarations begins to fade, America is being forced to confront a difficult question. Is the path of self-reliance it's embarked upon truly leading toward its goals, or merely severing the arteries that connect it to the rest of the world? Because if the price of control is the loss of trust, then the US will need far more than an executive order to reclaim its role as a global leader. At this point, attention is no longer fixated on GDP figures. The question has shifted to something deeper. Is this a step backward or a pivot forward? That answer won't come from the grand meeting rooms of Washington, nor will it be declared in late-night tweets from the White House. It will come from the quiet but determined choices of businesses, governments, and consumers around the globe, people who are increasingly aware that stability in trade doesn't stem from strength alone, but from commitment and trust. And in that very moment, the copper tariff begins to look like a test, a bold experiment that could make history, or become an expensive lesson. The door to recovery hasn't closed yet, but to move forward, America will need more than force. It will need patience, goodwill, and a strategy deeper than emotionally driven decisions. The 50% tariff on imported copper may well go down in history as one of the boldest moves of President Trump's second term. It was announced as a symbol of America First, a decisive attempt to reassert control over strategic supply chains. But between decisiveness and wisdom lies a very thin line, and after a chain reaction of responses from markets, allies, and even domestic industries, many are left asking, was this truly the right move, or a self-inflicted wound made in haste? In the short term, the consequences are clear. Supply was disrupted, prices soared, supply chains unraveled, small and mid-sized businesses were caught off guard and paid the price. Larger corporations began shifting production abroad to cut costs, ironically, the exact opposite of what the policy was intended to achieve. And more troubling still is the quiet, growing wave of mistrust. A policy can be reversed with the stroke of a pen, but broken trust is not so easily mended. Of course, there is still a long-term scenario with potential upside. The US could choose to invest heavily in domestic mining and refining, rebuilding capacity from the ground up, creating jobs, and reducing foreign dependence. But that path is far from easy. It demands tens of billions in investment, decades of effort, and, above all, the patience of the American public, who would bear higher costs, live through price adjustments, and make sacrifices long before any benefits materialize. Is a society so accustomed to speed and efficiency truly willing to pay that price? There's no denying the world is changing. The idea of self-sufficiency is gaining support as global supply chains prove more vulnerable than ever. But self-sufficiency isn't the same as self-isolation. Resilience doesn't mean severing every connection and walking alone. A true superpower is one strong enough to build internal strength, but also mature enough to foster trust and cooperation. And that's where America now finds itself. At a critical crossroads, continue down the path of unilateralism, building a shrinking circle of protectionism, or open a new chapter where national strength is reinforced by both domestic capacity and smart strategic connection with the rest of the world. The answer, as always in history, won't come from any single politician. It lies in the clarity of society, in how businesses adapt their strategies, in the choices made by every consumer, and most importantly, in our willingness to ask, what truly brings lasting prosperity? A tariff wall or an ecosystem built on trust, transparency, and mutual benefit? Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you have thoughts on the copper tariff policy, whether you support it or oppose it, whether you see it as progress or a setback, leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. And if you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our deep dives and timely updates on global economics and geopolitics. See you in the next video.